Dad snapped. You never invite us over. Maybe you're hiding something. Mom smirked. Or you're too good for this family now. My brother rolled his eyes. He probably spends all his money on himself anyway. I put my fork down and said, actually, there's something I've been waiting to tell you. The whole table froze when I pulled out the old family photos. I, 32M, finally told my family why they're never welcome in my home. The Sunday dinner invitation had come through a text from Mom 3 days prior. It wasn't a request. It was one of those messages that made it clear refusing wasn't really an option. So there I sat, fork in hand, pushing overcooked pot roast around my plate while my family picked apart my life with the precision of vultures on roadkill. Dad had started it, like he always did. He mentioned something about how I never invited them over to my place anymore, his tone dripping with that specific brand of accusation he'd perfected over the years. The implication hung there, that I was hiding something, that I thought I was too good for them now that I'd moved across town and wasn't at their beck and call every weekend. Mom jumped in immediately, that smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. She suggested maybe I'd gotten too fancy for my own family, living in my nice neighborhood while they were still in the old house. The one I'd grown up in. The one I'd spent 20 years trying to escape. My brother, sitting across from me with that perpetual look of bored superiority, rolled his eyes and added his contribution. He figured I probably spent all my money on myself anyway, which was rich coming from someone who'd borrowed $5,000 from me last year and never mentioned paying it back. I set my fork down carefully. The metal clinked against the plate louder than I'd intended, and the sound cut through their complaints like a knife. I told them there was actually something I'd been waiting to tell them, something I'd been holding on to for the right moment. The table went silent. Dad's jaw tightened. Mom's smirk faltered. My brother stopped mid-chew. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 weeks. Inside were photos, old ones, from when I was a kid. I laid them out on the table one by one, watching their faces change as they recognized what they were seeing. The first photo showed me at 8 years old, standing in the backyard with a baseball glove that was 2 sizes too big. Dad had promised to play catch with me that day. He never showed up, went to my brother's soccer tournament instead. I'd waited for 3 hours. The second was for my 10th birthday. The cake was there, the decorations were there, but if you looked closely at my face, you could see I'd been crying. Mom had forgotten to invite any of my friends because she'd been too busy organizing my brother's graduation party that was still 2 months away. I explained calmly that these weren't just random photos. They were a timeline, a carefully documented history of every broken promise, every missed event, every time I'd been made to feel like I didn't matter because I wasn't the golden child. Dad started to interrupt, but I kept going. I pulled out the next photo, me at 13, holding a certificate for making honor roll. Nobody had come to the ceremony. They'd been at my brother's football game, even though he spent most of it on the bench. Mom's face had gone pale. She tried to say something about how I was remembering things wrong, how they'd always treated us equally. But her voice lacked conviction. I continued laying out the evidence. Photo after photo, each one a small wound that had never quite healed. My high school graduation where they'd left early to beat traffic. The art show where I'd won second place and they hadn't bothered to come at all. The college acceptance letter I'd shown them, only for Dad to grunt and go back to watching my brother's playoff game on TV. My brother had the decency to look uncomfortable now. He pushed his plate away slightly. I explained that I'd spent the last 6 months in therapy, working through all of this. My therapist had suggested I might never get the closure I needed, but that documenting everything had helped me understand it wasn't my fault, that I hadn't deserved to be treated like an afterthought in my own family. The reason I never invited them over, I told them, wasn't because I was hiding anything. It was because my home was the one place I'd built where I felt valued, where I'd surrounded myself with people who actually showed up when they said they would, where I wasn't constantly competing for scraps of attention with my brother's latest accomplishment. Dad tried to defend himself then. He claimed they'd done their best, that raising kids was hard, that I was being dramatic. His face was red now, that vein in his forehead pulsing the way it did when he got angry. I pulled out another photo. This one was more recent, from 2 Christmases ago. I'd hosted dinner at my place that year, the one time I'd actually invited them over. In the photo, you could see me in the background, setting the table I'd spent hours preparing. In the foreground, Mom and Dad were both on their phones, texting with my brother about his new job offer. They'd barely touched the food. They'd left before dessert. That was when I decided they wouldn't be coming back. Mom started crying then. Those manipulative tears she'd always been good at producing. She insisted they'd always loved me, that I was being unfair, that families weren't perfect, but we were supposed to stick together. I agreed that families weren't perfect, but I pointed out there was a difference between imperfection and consistent neglect. I told her I'd spent years making excuses for them, convincing myself that maybe next time would be different, that maybe if I just tried harder, achieved more, made myself impossible to ignore, they'd finally see me. But I was done trying. My brother finally spoke up. He said I was overreacting, that this was ancient history, that I needed to let it go. His voice had that dismissive quality it always carried when my problems interfered with his comfort. I looked at him directly and asked if he remembered my college graduation. He hesitated, then nodded. I asked if he remembered giving his speech at the ceremony. He'd been the student speaker for his master's program, which happened to be the same day as my undergraduate graduation. He remembered that part clearly. I asked if he remembered that our parents had chosen to attend his speech instead of my ceremony, that I'd walked across that stage, accepted my diploma with honors, and looked out into the crowd to see an empty seat where my family should have been. He went quiet. I told him I didn't blame him for being the favorite. That wasn't his fault. But I did blame him for never once acknowledging it, for never standing up for me, for acting like I was crazy whenever I pointed out the obvious imbalance. The table had gone completely silent now. Even the sound of forks on plates had stopped. I gathered up the photos slowly, putting them back in the envelope. I explained that I wasn't doing this to hurt them or to start a fight. I was doing it because they'd asked why they weren't invited to my home, and they deserved an honest answer. My home was my sanctuary. It was where I'd built a life with people who respected me, who showed up for me, who treated me like I mattered. And I wasn't going to pollute that space with the same dynamics that had made my childhood so lonely. Dad slammed his hand on the table. He said I was being cruel, that after everything they'd done for me, this was how I repaid them. He listed off the things they'd provided: food, shelter, education, as if meeting basic parental obligations erased years of emotional absence. I stood up then. I thanked them for dinner and told them I'd be leaving. Mom grabbed my arm, begging me not to go, saying we needed to talk about this properly. But her grip was weak, and her eyes weren't meeting mine. I gently pulled away and explained there was nothing left to talk about. I'd said what I needed to say. They could do with that information whatever they wanted. But the boundary remained. My home was off limits, and I was done pretending everything was fine. My brother called after me as I headed for the door. He asked what I wanted from them, what would make this right. I paused in the doorway and turned back. I told him honestly that I didn't know if anything could make it right. The damage was done. But if they wanted any relationship with me going forward, it would need to be different. It would require them to actually acknowledge what had happened, to stop gaslighting me about my own experiences, to treat me with the same consideration they'd always shown him. Whether they were capable of that remained to be seen. Update 1. 3 weeks passed without contact. No calls, no texts, nothing. Part of me had expected that. It was their usual pattern when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Ignore it long enough, and maybe it would go away. But I'd underestimated Mom's need to control the narrative. She started calling my extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions about my behavior. My phone blew up with messages from relatives telling me I was being disrespectful, that I should apologize, that family was everything, and I was throwing it away over nothing. The story Mom had told them was predictably distorted. According to her version, I'd shown up to a nice family dinner and attacked them out of nowhere with false accusations, trying to destroy the family because I was jealous of my brother's success. I'd anticipated this might happen, which was why I'd made copies of everything. I sent a group message to every family member who'd contacted me. Attached were scans of the photos, along with a brief, factual timeline of events. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add dramatic flair. I just presented the evidence and let it speak for itself. The responses varied. Some family members went silent. A few apologized for jumping to conclusions. My uncle, Dad's brother, called me directly. He said he'd always suspected something was off about how they treated me compared to my brother, but he'd never felt it was his place to interfere. He apologized for that now. Mom was furious about the group message. She called me screaming, accusing me of trying to humiliate her in front of the whole family. I let her vent for about 30 seconds, then calmly explained that she'd started this by spreading lies. I was simply correcting the record. She hung up on me. Dad's response came 2 days later, in the form of an email. It was long, rambling, and mostly defensive. He insisted they'd always tried their best, that if I felt neglected it was because I'd been an easy kid who didn't demand attention like my brother had. He actually wrote that it was somehow my fault for not being difficult enough to warrant their focus. The email ended with a guilt trip about how I was tearing the family apart and how disappointed he was in me. I didn't respond. My brother reached out separately. His message was shorter, less hostile than I'd expected. He admitted he'd never realized how different our experiences had been growing up. He'd always just assumed we were both treated the same, and he was starting to understand that maybe he'd been too absorbed in his own life to notice. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was closer to accountability than I'd gotten from our parents. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but that I needed space to process everything. He said he understood. The distance felt good, necessary. For the first time in my life, I wasn't organizing my schedule around their expectations or bracing myself for the next disappointment. I was just existing, peacefully, in the life I'd built. Update 2. 2 months after the dinner, I got a call from my brother. He wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of us. I was hesitant but agreed. We met at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. He looked tired, older than I remembered, though it had only been weeks since I'd seen him. He started by apologizing properly this time. He said he'd spent the past 2 months really thinking about everything I'd shown them, about our childhood, about the pattern of behavior I'd outlined. He'd even talked to his therapist about it. Apparently his wife had been pushing him to work on some things, and this had become part of that conversation. He admitted he'd benefited from the favoritism without ever acknowledging it existed, that he'd gotten so used to being the priority that he'd stopped questioning whether it was fair. He said he was sorry for dismissing my feelings all those years, for not standing up for me, for letting me bear the weight of their neglect alone. I appreciated the apology. I told him that honestly. But I also explained that sorry didn't erase the past, and I wasn't sure yet what our relationship could look like going forward. He nodded, said he understood. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. Our parents were apparently talking about selling the house. Mom had mentioned it to him during a phone call, framed as a financial decision, but really, he suspected, motivated by wanting to escape the memories I'd brought up, to start fresh somewhere new and pretend none of this had happened. I wasn't surprised. Running from problems was their specialty. My brother said he'd told them he wouldn't help with the move unless they dealt with this properly, that he was done enabling their refusal to take accountability. His wife had apparently been instrumental in helping him see how toxic the family dynamics were. I asked him what their response had been. He laughed bitterly and said Mom had cried and Dad had gotten angry. Standard operating procedure. But for the first time, he hadn't backed down. He'd told them flat out that they'd failed me as parents, and until they acknowledged that, he was maintaining his own boundaries with them. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt sad that it had taken this long, that my brother had needed his wife to point out what should have been obvious. But mostly I felt tired. We talked for another hour. He asked about my life, my job, the things I was doing for myself. I realized it might have been the first time he'd ever really asked about my life without it being performative or obligatory. As we left, he asked if maybe we could try to build something new between us. A relationship that wasn't tied to our parents' dysfunction. I told him maybe, that I'd need time to trust that he was serious about changing, but that I was willing to see where things went. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a door left open instead of slammed shut. Update 3. 4 months after the dinner, Mom finally reached out with something resembling accountability. Not a full apology, she still couldn't quite manage that, but an acknowledgement that maybe she hadn't always been aware of how her actions affected me. She asked if we could talk. I agreed to a phone call. She cried through most of it, talked about how hard it had been raising 2 kids, how my brother had always needed more attention because of his anxiety issues as a child, how she'd just assumed I was fine because I never complained. I pointed out that I had complained, multiple times, and I'd been ignored every time. She went quiet at that. I told her I understood parenting was difficult. I even acknowledged that my brother probably had needed more support in some ways. But that didn't excuse the complete imbalance, the missed events, the years of being made to feel invisible in my own family. She asked what she could do to fix it. I told her honestly that I didn't know if she could. That trust, once broken this severely, didn't just magically repair itself because someone finally admitted fault. That I needed to see consistent change over time before I could even consider letting them back into my life in any meaningful way. She asked what consistent change looked like. I gave her concrete examples. Showing up when she said she would. Remembering important dates without me having to remind her. Actually listening when I talked instead of waiting for her turn to speak. Treating me with the same consideration she automatically extended to my brother. Basic things, really. Things most parents did without thinking. She promised she'd try. I told her I'd believe it when I saw it. Dad never called. I heard through my brother that he was still angry, still insisting I'd overreacted. That was fine. I'd stopped needing his validation years ago. My life continued without the minute. I got a promotion at work. Started dating someone who actually showed up for me consistently. Deepened friendships with people who valued my presence. My home remained my sanctuary, filled with plants I'd nurtured, books I'd collected, photos of moments that actually mattered. The people who visited were people who'd earned that privilege through respect and reciprocity. Sometimes my brother stopped by. Those visits were cautious at first, both of us navigating new territory. But slowly, carefully, we were building something that felt more authentic than what we'd had before. Mom sent occasional texts, small attempts at connection, articles she thought I'd like, questions about my life. I responded sometimes, brief but not unkind. Baby steps towards something that might eventually resemble a relationship, though it would never be what it could have been if she'd done this work 30 years ago. The photos stayed in that envelope, tucked away in a drawer. I didn't need to look at them anymore. I'd said what needed to be said, set the boundaries that needed to be set. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying their dysfunction around like a weight on my shoulders. I'd put it down, left it at their table with that uneaten pot roast, and walked away into a life I'd built entirely for myself. That was my revenge, not destruction, but liberation. Not hurting them, but finally, completely, choosing myself.